something is dying in the South. Churches that once had waiting lists for pew space are now renting their buildings to yoga studios and craft breweries. The Bible Belt, the most religiously dominant region in the most religious wealthy nation on earth, is coming undone. And most people think they know why. They say it's the internet, or social media, or godless liberals poisoning the culture. But they're wrong. The real reason is something far more uncomfortable, something the church itself created. Something that didn't happen to faith from the outside, it happened from the inside. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The numbers don't lie. Let's start with what we actually know, not the narratives, not the talking points, the raw, uncomfortable data that nobody in a Sunday sermon is going to read out loud. In 2007, roughly 78% of Americans identified as Christian. That number felt immovable, permanent. Like the country itself was built on it, and nothing short of an apocalypse could shake it loose. By 2023, that number had dropped to under 63%. Do the math. In less than 2 decades, more than 50 million Americans stopped calling themselves Christian, not globally, not across some broad cultural shift spread over centuries, in one country, in the span of a single generation. Now think about what 50 million people looks like. That is larger than the entire population of California, larger than Canada. We are talking about a mass exodus from organized religion at a scale that has no modern precedent in the Western world. And the collapse is not happening evenly. It is fastest, deepest, and most disorienting in the states that had the most to lose. Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, the heart of the Bible Belt. These were not places where religion was a weekend hobby or a casual cultural identity. Religion was infrastructure. Churches funded hospitals. Churches ran schools. Churches determined who got elected, who got hired, who got trusted, and who got quietly frozen out. To be outside the church in these communities was not just a spiritual choice. It was a social and economic one. So when we see those states leading the collapse, we are not just watching belief shift. We are watching an entire social architecture begin to crack. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The fastest growing religious category in those same states right now is not atheism. It is not agnosticism. It is not Buddhism or Islam or any alternative system of meaning. It is simply none. A checkbox, a shrug, a refusal to name it at all. That word carries more weight than it appears to. None does not mean empty. It means something was there, and now it is not, and the person is not yet sure what to call what replaced it. None is not an ending. It is a beginning that has not found its language yet. And that distinction matters enormously for what comes next. The generation that walked out. Here is the thing about religious decline that nobody wants to say out loud. It does not happen in dramatic moments. There is no single argument, no single scandal, no single Sunday where the lights go out and everyone agrees it is over. It happens quietly. It happens one person at a time. One unreturned phone call to a pastor, one family dinner where the questions got too uncomfortable, one Sunday morning where someone sat in the parking lot, engine running, and just drove past. And the people making that drive are not who the narrative says they should be. The easy story is that faith is being stolen by angry atheists, by coastal elites, by professors with agendas and algorithms with none. That story is comforting to the institution because it places the blame outside. But the data tells a completely different story. The people walking out are the kids who grew up inside, the ones who memorized the verses at vacation Bible school, who went to every youth group retreat, who meant it when they prayed, who were not performing belief, but actually living it, breathing it, building their entire identity around it. These are not people who were never converted. These are people who were deeply, genuinely formed by the church and then, at some point, started noticing things that did not add up. Millennials and Gen Z are leaving organized religion at rates that have researchers using words like historic and unprecedented. But here is what the exit surveys keep finding, over and over again. and what almost nobody wants to sit with honestly. They are not leaving because they stopped caring about meaning. They are not leaving because they want to sleep in on Sundays or live without moral accountability. They are leaving because they started caring intensely about something the church specifically trained them not to pursue: honesty. They asked questions, reasonable ones, about suffering, about science, about the people the church excluded, about the gap between what was preached on Sunday and what happened the rest of the week. And what they found, in congregation after congregation, was not curiosity met with curiosity. What they found was a wall. Silence dressed up as certainty. Pressure dressed up as love. You can only tell a generation raised on instant access to information to simply trust and not question for so long before something breaks. And what broke was not their faith in meaning. It was their faith in the institution claiming to hold it. When doubt became a sin, think carefully about what it actually means to grow up in a community where doubt is dangerous, not uncomfortable, not discouraged, dangerous. Where asking the wrong question in the wrong room can cost you your friendships, your reputation, your place at the family table. Where the price of saying, "I'm not sure I believe this anymore," is not a thoughtful conversation, but a slow, quiet removal from every circle that made your life feel safe and legible. That is not a minor social pressure. That is a total ecosystem built around a single, unspoken rule. Certainty is membership, and doubt is betrayal. For decades, the Bible Belt ran on exactly that system. And it worked, because the church was not just offering theology. It was offering something far more powerful and far more human than any doctrinal statement. It was offering belonging, real, textured, daily belonging of the kind that is increasingly rare in modern life. Your neighbors were your congregation. Your social calendar was the church calendar. Your children's friendships, your professional reputation, your standing in the community, all of it ran through the same institution. To question the faith was not just a spiritual risk. It was a threat to your entire social architecture. And the church understood this, whether consciously or not. The belonging was real, but it was also conditional. Stay inside the lines, ask the approved questions, perform the expected certainties, and you were held. Step outside, and the warmth evaporated with a speed that told you everything about what the belonging was actually built on. There is a word for a relationship that offers love on the condition of silence. It is not community, it is control. And millions of people raised inside that system spent years, sometimes decades, unable to name what they were feeling because the language to describe it had been carefully kept from them. But something shifted. Not in the theology, not in the arguments. Something shifted in the conditions that made the silence sustainable. Because for the system to work, it needed one thing above everything else. It needed to be the only option. It needed the person doubting alone in their bedroom at 2 a.m. to believe that they were the only one, that the questions were theirs alone, that no one else had ever sat where they were sitting and felt what they were feeling. And then something arrived that made that particular loneliness impossible to maintain. Something that fit in a pocket and changed every calculation the institution had been running for generations. The phone changed everything. Before the internet, if you had doubts, you were alone with them in a way that is almost impossible to describe to someone who grew up with a smartphone. Not alone, like lonely. Alone, like sealed. You might have found a book, if you knew what to look for and where to look, and if the right book happened to make it past the filters of a community that was quietly, constantly curating what you were allowed to encounter. You might have had one whispered conversation with one person who swore you to secrecy before they said anything real. But mostly, if you doubted, you sat with it in silence. And silence, over time, starts to feel like confirmation that you are the problem. That was not an accident. Institutions that depend on unquestioned belief have always understood, at some level, that the greatest threat is not a better argument. It is the simple knowledge that other people exist who think differently and have not been destroyed by it. Isolation was never incidental to how the Bible Belt maintained its hold. It was the mechanism. Keep the flock together, keep outsiders out, keep the questions from finding each other. A doubt that cannot locate another doubt stays small and manageable, and eventually gets buried under enough social pressure to stop causing trouble. Then, the internet arrived. And then, the smartphone made the internet personal, portable, and private. And everything the isolation strategy depended on collapsed almost overnight. Suddenly, a teenager in rural Mississippi, lying in her childhood bedroom at midnight, could type a single sentence into a search bar and find herself inside a conversation with 10,000 people who had felt exactly what she was feeling. She could find former pastors who had spent decades inside the institution and walked away, former missionaries, former worship leaders, people who had believed harder than she had and still arrived at the same uncomfortable place. She could find the theological arguments the church had never told her existed, not because they were weak, but precisely because they were not. The church's monopoly was never really on truth. It was on access. It controlled what questions seemed thinkable by controlling what answers seemed available. And that control required an information environment it no longer had any power to maintain. The internet did not kill faith. That framing misses the point entirely. What it killed was the enforced isolation that allowed a single institution to define the boundaries of the possible. Once those boundaries dissolved, once the teenager with doubts could see that she was not broken or uniquely faithless, but part of something vast and growing, the entire downstream architecture of social control began to shake. And it has not stopped shaking since. The scandal factor. But the internet alone does not explain the speed or the depth of what is happening. Information access loosens the grip. It does not necessarily shatter it. For that, you need something more visceral. Something that does not just challenge what people believe, but destroys why they trusted the people telling them what to believe. And that is where the story gets darker, in a way that is genuinely difficult to sit with. Abuse scandals, financial corruption, leadership that preached sacrifice on Sunday and practiced self-protection every other day of the week. These are not isolated incidents scattered across an otherwise healthy institution. The evidence, when it finally came out, pointed to something systemic, something structural, something that required active, coordinated effort to maintain. The Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant denomination in America. For decades, it positioned itself as the moral backbone of the nation, the guardian of family values, the institution you could trust when the rest of the culture was losing its way. In 2022, an independent investigation revealed that for nearly 2 decades, leaders at the highest levels of the denomination had compiled a secret list of accused abusers and had actively worked to prevent abuse survivors from being heard, from being believed, and from seeing any accountability reach the men who had harmed them. Hundreds of victims, hundreds of churches implicated. Leadership that knew, documented that they knew, and chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to protect the institution over the people the institution claimed to exist for. Read that again slowly. This was not negligence. It was a choice. Made over and over again, across years, by people who stood at pulpits and told their congregations that the church was where you came to find truth and safety and grace. Now think about what that revelation does to a young person who was raised to believe that the church was not just a community, but the moral center of civilization itself, the place where right and wrong were defined, the authority that gave every other authority its legitimacy. When that institution is exposed not just as flawed, but as deliberately, strategically cruel toward the most vulnerable people in its care, something breaks that cannot be repaired with a statement of apology or a restructured committee. They did not just lose a belief, they lost the entire framework that organized their understanding of good and evil. And betrayal at that scale does not simply push someone out of a pew. It rewires the way they process authority at a fundamental level. It makes them ask, for the first time, what else they were told to trust without question. And that question, once asked honestly, does not stay inside the church walls. It spreads outward into every institution, every hierarchy, every system that ever asked for faith without accountability. And it spreads fast. The politics problem. Here is a paradox that does not get nearly enough honest examination. The more aggressively the church pursued political power, the faster it bled the people it was supposed to be serving. Not because politics is inherently corrupting, though that argument has merit, but because the merger of faith and partisan politics did something specific and devastating to the way religion functions in a person's inner life. It turned a search for meaning into a team sport. And once that happened, everything that made faith feel transcendent started to feel like strategy instead. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the late 1970s and early 1980s. A group of politically minded evangelical leaders made a calculated decision. They looked at the changing cultural landscape, felt the ground shifting beneath their feet, and decided that the most effective response was not spiritual renewal, but political consolidation. The Moral Majority, founded by Jerry Falwell in 1979, became the blueprint. Align evangelical Christianity tightly and explicitly with the Republican Party. Trade the pulpit's moral independence for the party's organizational infrastructure. Gain access to power in exchange for delivering votes. In the short term, it worked extraordinarily well. Evangelicals became one of the most reliable and courted voting blocs in American politics. Politicians flew to meet with pastors. Pastors appeared at rallies. The church felt, for a moment, like it was sitting at the center of the nation's future. But every generation raised inside that arrangement watched something happen that the architects of the merger either did not foresee or chose not to care about. They watched faith become a jersey, a tribal marker, a signal of which team you were on rather than a genuine, searching engagement with questions that do not have easy answers. And when faith becomes a jersey, the entire interior life of religion collapses into performance. You are no longer seeking truth. You are keeping score. You are no longer sitting with mystery. You are defending a position. Young people felt this distinction with a clarity that surprised a lot of older observers. Even young people who were politically conservative, who shared many of the same values the church claimed to represent, could feel the difference between genuine spiritual community and a political operation wearing religious clothing. It felt hollow in a way they often struggled to articulate, but could not unfeel once they had noticed it. There's a reason the word evangelical now registers in surveys and conversations as a political identity before it registers as a spiritual one. That did not happen by accident. It happened because the institution made a deliberate trade. It chose proximity to power over the harder, slower, less glamorous work of genuine transformation. It traded transcendence for influence. And a generation raised to believe in something eternal looked at what the church had become and chose, quietly and in enormous numbers, to leave something that had made itself very, very temporary. The prosperity gospel's quiet ruin. And then there is the prosperity gospel. If the political merger was the church's most visible mistake, this one is its most intimate, the most personal. The one that did not play out in news cycles or congressional hearings, but in hospital rooms and foreclosed homes and quiet moments of devastation, where a person looked at everything they had been promised and felt something inside them give way. The prosperity gospel is, at its core, a simple and seductive idea. Faith equals blessing. God rewards the faithful with wealth, health, and success in proportion to the sincerity and size of their belief. Pray correctly, give generously, trust completely. And the universe, guided by a God who wants you to flourish, will return that faith in material form. It sounds like hope. It preaches like fire. It fills stadiums and television networks and offering plates with a consistency that would impress any marketer. Joel Osteen built a congregation of tens of thousands in a converted sports arena in Houston. Kenneth Copeland accumulated a net worth that would embarrass most Fortune 500 executives. The theology was a product, and the product sold. But underneath the polished surface, it was setting a trap with a very specific mechanism, because the prosperity gospel does not just promise reward. It creates a logical framework in which suffering becomes evidence of personal failure. If blessing follows faith, then the absence of blessing must follow the absence of faith. The math is simple, and it is merciless. So what happens when a woman who has tithed faithfully for 30 years is diagnosed with stage 4 cancer? What does the prosperity gospel say to a family that prayed over their home every morning and still lost it in a flood, or a factory closure, or a medical bill that arrived without warning and without mercy? What does it offer the father who believed harder than he had ever believed anything and watched his child suffer anyway? It says, in the only language its theology allows, you did not believe enough, you held something back. The fault is yours. Your pain is your failure made visible. That is not a minor theological error. That is a cruelty so profound it is difficult to fully measure. It takes the most vulnerable moment in a human life and transforms it into an indictment. It hands suffering people a framework that adds shame to their grief and calls it spiritual guidance. Millions of Bible Belt families did not encounter this as an abstract theological proposition. They lived it. They prayed harder when the first prayer did not work. They gave more when the finances were already desperate. They believed longer than belief had any right to ask of them, and the promises did not come. Not because they were weak or faithless or spiritually deficient, but because the promise itself was constructed on a foundation that had nothing to do with how reality actually operates. You can sustain almost any belief system through social pressure, through isolation, through the sunk cost of a lifetime built around it. But there is a limit. And the prosperity gospel kept sending people directly to that limit, over and over again, in their most unguarded moments. At some point, the weight of lived experience becomes impossible to argue with. And when the lie finally breaks open, it does not just take the theology with it. It takes the trust that made the theology possible in the first place. What's rising in the wreckage? So what fills the space? This is the question that almost never gets asked seriously, because the cultural conversation around religious decline tends to stop at the leaving, churches emptying, numbers dropping, the belt loosening, and then the story ends, as if the millions of people walking out simply dissolved into a secular void, taking their need for meaning with them like luggage they finally agreed to put down. But that is not what is happening, and missing this part means missing the most important part of the story. People are not leaving religion for nothing. That framing fundamentally misunderstands what religion was actually providing and what human beings actually need. Nobody walks away from a system that gave them community, moral structure, a sense of cosmic purpose, and a language for grief and joy and everything in between, and simply stops needing those things. The needs do not leave with the institution. They go looking for new containers. Some people are finding quieter, more personal expressions of faith. Not the stadium version, not the politically branded version, something older and more interior. They still pray, still believe in something larger than themselves, still find the sacred in places the institution never pointed them toward. They have not lost God. They have lost the organization that claimed to be the exclusive intermediary. And for many of them, that feels less like a loss and more like finally being able to breathe. Some are finding community in secular spaces with an intentionality that previous generations never needed to develop because community used to come pre-assembled. They are building it in gyms and running clubs, in neighborhood associations and mutual aid networks, in book groups that meet on Sunday mornings with a sincerity that would feel familiar to anyone who has ever sat in a pew and genuinely meant it. The hunger for belonging did not disappear. It migrated. Some are sitting across from therapists instead of pastors, finding that the language of psychology gives them tools for the interior life that the language of sin and salvation never quite reached. Confession was always, at some level, about the relief of being known and not condemned. Therapy offers something structurally similar, with different furniture and different terminology and, crucially, different incentives. And then, there is a group that is growing faster than researchers expected, and that represents something genuinely new in American life. People who are not replacing the old framework with a different pre-built one, but who are constructing their own moral architecture from scratch, reading across traditions, borrowing from philosophy and psychology and science and ancient wisdom and personal experience, building something that has never had an official name because it has never been organized enough to need one. For the first time in American history, millions of people are navigating the most fundamental human questions about meaning, about how to treat each other, about what to do with suffering, about what happens when we die, without a handed-down system to stand on, no inherited map, no institutional authority to defer to when the questions get too heavy. To people who believe that framework was always essential, that is a terrifying development. A civilization without shared moral architecture, sliding toward chaos. But to the people living it, many of them describe something else entirely. Not emptiness, not chaos, something that feels, for the first time, like intellectual honesty. Like they are finally asking the real questions instead of the approved ones. Like the search itself, uncertain and unguaranteed and occasionally frightening, is more alive than the certainty it replaced ever managed to be. What this means for all of us. Here is the part I want you to sit with before we close. Not as a conclusion, but as a question that extends well beyond anything we have talked about so far. Because if you have been listening carefully, you may have already noticed that the story we have been telling is not really contained by its subject matter. The Bible Belt is the setting. It is not the point. This is not a story about religion. It is a story about what happens when any institution, anywhere, in any domain of human life, stops serving the people it was built to serve and starts serving itself. When the mission quietly inverts. When the organization that was created to meet a human need begins treating that need primarily as leverage. This pattern is not unique to churches. It shows up in governments and corporations, in universities and media organizations, in political movements and nonprofit bureaucracies. The specific theology or ideology is almost beside the point. The structure of the failure is always recognizable once you know what you are looking at. Authority that stops earning trust and starts demanding it. Belonging that becomes conditional on silence rather than sustained by genuine connection. Leadership that responds to internal criticism, the way an immune system responds to a foreign body, not by engaging with it, but by isolating and expelling it. These are not specifically religious pathologies. They are institutional ones, and the Bible Belt simply ran them at a scale and intensity that made the consequences impossible to ignore. What makes this moment in the American South historically significant is not the religious dimension. It is the demonstration, played out across millions of individual lives and decades of accumulated data, of something we tend to underestimate about human beings. We are meaning-seeking creatures. That part gets acknowledged often. We need purpose and narrative and community, and a sense that our lives are oriented towards something worth orienting toward. Institutions that provide these things hold enormous power over us, and we give that power willingly, even gratefully, because the alternative, navigating existence without any of those anchors, is genuinely difficult. But we are also lie-detecting creatures, and this part gets talked about far less, perhaps because it is less comfortable for the institutions doing the talking. We have extraordinarily sensitive instruments for registering the gap between what we are told and what we observe, between the values an institution claims to hold and the choices it actually makes under pressure, between the love it professes and the coldness it deploys when that love becomes inconvenient. We may not always be able to name what we are detecting. We may suppress the signal for years, even decades, under the weight of social pressure and sunk cost and genuine love for the community around us. But the instrument keeps running. And at some point, for enough people, the accumulated signal becomes impossible to override. That is what happened in the Bible Belt. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow, inevitable arithmetic. The institution kept making withdrawals from an account it assumed had no bottom. Trust, integrity, the basic credibility that comes from doing what you say you stand for, treated as inexhaustible resources rather than fragile ones that require constant, unglamorous tending. And one by one, then in growing numbers, then in a wave that is still moving, people's internal instruments told them the same thing. What I am being asked to believe about this place no longer matches what I can see with my own eyes. When meaning-seeking runs directly into lie detecting, one of them eventually wins. And across the American South, in a story that is still unfolding and still not fully understood, we are watching in real time which one it turned out to be. The Bible Belt is not dying because people stopped believing in something greater than themselves. It is dying because a system that claimed to point toward the sacred kept choosing the profane every time the cost of integrity got too high. And people, especially young people, have a precise and unforgiving word for that gap between what is preached and what is practiced. But underneath the hypocrisy is something worth naming, honestly. The hunger did not leave with the institution. It never does. The questions that drove people into those pews in the first place are exactly as alive today as they have ever been. What are we here for? How should we treat each other? What do we owe the people who are suffering? No denomination holds a copyright on those questions. No building contains them. What rises in the wreckage of the Bible Belt depends entirely on whether we are willing to ask them honestly without demanding comfortable answers in return. Keep questioning. That is where everything real begins.